Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be taking a look at the life and crimes of William Pierce Jr.
Oh, yeah, this is going to be a good one.
Yeah, this is interesting. This is a serial killer who was operating in the American South back in the early 1970s. We're going to be using excerpts from his Wikipedia page to guide our conversation.
All right.
So get ready for a journey through poverty, escalating acts of violence, and a legal battle that spanned decades.
Yeah, I mean, it's a case that really forces us to consider all those complex factors,
Right,
that might lead to someone, ending up as a serial killer.
right.
It's not a simple equation, as we'll see.
No, it's not. And that's what makes this so fascinating, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So let's start with his early life. William Pierce Jr. was born in 1931 in rural Georgia, right in the middle of the Great Depression.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so you can only imagine the hardship at that time.
For sure, yeah.
Poverty was hitting families really hard. So do you think that could have had an effect on his development?
It's certainly something to consider. When a child grows up in an environment, like that, where there's scarcity and instability,
Right.
it can create a sense of, constant threat and insecurity. And unfortunately for Pierce, the instability didn't stop there. His parents had a pretty volatile relationship. Eventually, they divorced when he was a teenager.
So he's got the economic struggles, he's got the broken home,
Yeah.
and it gets even darker. The Wikipedia page mentions that his mother became physically abusive after the divorce. That's just a terrible burden for any child to carry.
Yeah, it is.
How much do you think childhood trauma contributes to violent behavior, later in life?
Well, there have been studies, right, that show a strong correlation between childhood abuse and an increased risk of violent behavior. Obviously, it's not a direct causal link, but severe trauma can lead to a whole range of, emotional and psychological issues that might contribute to aggression and just difficulty forming healthy relationships.
Makes you wonder how differently things might have turned out if he had a more stable and supportive upbringing.
Right.
And it seems like we had other challenges, too. The source mentions he had a low IQ score,
Uh-huh.
which probably made school and social situations difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah. A low IQ can lead to, feelings of inadequacy, frustration, especially if they're in an environment where they're not getting the right support.
Right.
Pierce actually dropped out of school after ninth grade,
Oh, wow.
and he struggled to hold down steady jobs.
Right.
He was even in the Army for a bit, but was discharged for medical reasons.
There's this one detail that really caught my eye. His mother apparently submitted some questionable medical documents to get him discharged. Is there any way to know what was really going on there?
Unfortunately, the source doesn't really give us any more information about that.
Okay.
It's just one of those little details that makes you wonder. But we do know that after the Army, Pierce had a failed marriage and he continued to just bounce around from job to job.
Right.
And then in the late 1950s, something happened that could have drastically changed his life.
This is where it gets really interesting. He was injured in an industrial accident and ended up with a head injury. I've always heard that head trauma can have long-lasting effects on personality and behavior.
That's true. In Pierce's case, the accident reportedly led to, significant personality changes. He developed like a grandiose sense of self-importance and began to see himself as superior to others.
So, like, some real red flags there.
Yeah.
Could that be a sign of a personality disorder?
Yeah, it's possible. Personality disorders, they involve inflexible and unhealthy personality traits
Right.
that impair a person's functioning in relationships. So the combination of, his existing challenges, the trauma from his childhood, and now this head injury could have created like a dangerous mix.
And unfortunately, those warning signs seem to have gone unnoticed. His first run-in with the law was in 1959 for a theft conviction, which landed him in prison.
Uh-huh.
But even that wasn't enough to, set him on a different path.
Well, and what's even more chilling is that, while he was in prison, a psychologist actually assessed him and warned that he could be a danger to himself and others.
Oh, wow.
And that prediction, as we know, turned out to be tragically accurate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So even back then, there were signs that he was capable of violence. He was released on parole in 1970, and that's when the killing spree began. His first victim was an 18-year-old babysitter in South Carolina named Ann Goodwin.
And the brutality of that crime, it really sets the tone for what was to come. Robbery, sexual assault, and murder. It was a horrific start to what became a series of increasingly violent acts.
It makes you wonder if there was something about being released from prison, like that feeling of being untethered, lack of support, that maybe triggered this descent into violence.
Yeah, that's a really important question. Re-entry into society after prison can be incredibly challenging,
Right.
especially for those who haven't really addressed the underlying issues that may have contributed to their behavior in the first place.
Right. Right. And for Pierce, things just escalated from there. Just a few months later, He kidnapped and murdered a 13-year-old girl, Margaret Petcatino.
Yeah.
And this case became notorious
Yeah.
because of the later legal battles surrounding these conflicting confessions.
Right, right. The Catino case is just one example of many twists and turns that would emerge in Pierce's legal proceedings.
Right.
It really raises questions about the reliability of confessions
Yeah.
and the complexities of, navigating the justice system.
It's already clear that this could be a crazy story and we're just getting started. But before we move on to the rest of Pierce's crimes, I wanted to pause here and just ask you, what's striking you the most so far about this case?
I think what gets me is just how the brutality of his crimes escalated.
Right.
It's like a snowball effect, Each act just becomes more brazen and violent.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that in the next part, so stay tuned.
Yeah, it's just wild how it just keeps escalating.
Yeah, you're right. After the tragic murders of Ann Goodwin and Peg Gattino, Pierce's crimes did take an even darker turn.
Yeah.
In August of 1970, he committed this brutal axe murder during a service station robbery in Beaufort, South Carolina.
Uh-huh.
The victim was James L. Sires.
Yeah, and the level of violence in that case, it's truly disturbing.
Yeah.
According to the source, Pierce confessed to hacking Sires to death.
Oh my gosh.
And then stealing $970 before fleeing the scene.
But wait, didn't Pierce later recant all of his confessions?
Right.
Including this one.
He did.
He claimed that he was coerced and under the influence when he was being questioned.
Yeah, that's right. And the validity of his confession, it's a major point of contention in this case.
Right.
It raises those crucial questions about the justice system.
Yeah.
Were his rights violated during the interrogation?
Right.
Can a confession that's obtained under duress, can that even be considered reliable?
It's a real ethical and legal dilemma. On the one hand, you have his confession, which is a powerful piece of evidence.
Right.
But on the other hand, if it was coerced, that throws everything into question.
Exactly. And this is where, the physical evidence is crucial.
Right.
Remember, investigators found items that belonged to several victims
Right.
in Pierce's possession, and that links him to the crimes regardless of the confession.
So even without the confession, there's a strong case against him.
Yeah.
But it's still unsettling. Those questions about the interrogation techniques used.
Right.
It makes you wonder how many other cases might be out there, where a confession was obtained under questionable circumstances.
It's a sobering thought. The justice system, it's designed to protect the innocent and punish the guilty.
Right.
But as this case shows, that it's not always that simple.
Right.
There are nuances, there are gray areas, and the potential for human error that we just have to acknowledge.
And while these legal questions are being debated, we can't forget about the human cost of his action.
Oh, for sure.
He was taking lives, destroying families, and leaving a trail of grief and trauma.
Absolutely. Every victim had a story, a network of loved ones,
Right.
a future that was stolen from them.
Right.
And it's important to keep that in mind as we, go through these details. It's easy to get caught up in the legal complexities.
Right.
But we should never lose sight of that real human impact.
You're right. You're right. We can't allow these victims to become just names on a Wikipedia page.
Yeah.
One victim in particular, 17-year-old Kathy Jo Anderson, she disappeared from Columbia, South Carolina just a few days before Christmas in 1970.
Oh, wow.
Imagine the heartbreak her family must have endured during that holiday season.
Yeah, her disappearance and the later discovery of her body in February of 71.
Right.
That just added another layer of tragedy to this already horrific case.
Yeah.
It reminds us that behind every, headline-grabbing crime, there are countless stories of individual suffering and loss.
It's a chilling reminder that even during a time of year that's associated with joy and celebration, darkness can be lurking,
Yeah.
Do we know anything about the circumstances surrounding Kathy Jo Anderson's disappearance?
Unfortunately, the Wikipedia page, it doesn't provide specific details about each crime.
Okay.
It focuses more on the broader narrative of Pierce's life and, the legal proceedings. But even without all those details, we can imagine the fear and uncertainty her family must have experienced, during those months when they didn't know where she was.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of the ripple effect of violence.
Yeah.
The impact goes far beyond the immediate victim. It touches families, friends, entire communities.
Exactly. These crimes create this climate of fear and vulnerability, and, it makes people question their safety and their trust in others.
And as we're grappling with the weight of all these tragedies, we also have to face this daunting question.
Yeah.
What drives someone to commit such horrific acts?
Right.
What's going on in the mind of a serial killer?
Yeah, that's a question that's fascinated, criminologists and psychologists for decades.
Right.
And there's no easy answer, not single factor that can explain it.
Right.
We can analyze Pierce's childhood, his low IQ, the head injury, the potential personality disorder.
Right.
But even with all of that, we're still left with a mystery.
Yeah, it's almost like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. We
Exactly.
can see the outline, but some parts will likely always remain obscured.
Precisely. And that's part of what makes true crime both captivating and unsettling.
Right.
It forces us to confront the reality that evil exists in the world.
Right.
And sometimes we may never fully understand its motivations.
And the story of William Pierce Jr. has become even more intriguing in recent years because of his brief appearance in the Netflix series Mindhunter.
Right.
That show really delves into the psychology of serial killers using interviews with real-life criminals to try to understand their motivations.
It's a fascinating but also a controversial approach.
Yeah.
Some argue that, giving these killers a platform, even in a fictionalized context, glorifies their crimes.
Right.
Others believe that understanding their psychology is essential to preventing future tragedies.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Right.
But it definitely highlights that enduring fascination with true crime.
For sure.
People are drawn to these stories, perhaps, to try to make sense of the senseless.
Right.
Or maybe just to reassure themselves that evil exists out there, separate from their own lives.
But as we continue to explore Pierce's case, it's crucial to remember that this isn't just a story for our entertainment.
Right.
This is a real-life tragedy with real-life victims.
Yeah.
We have a responsibility to approach it with sensitivity and respect.
Right.
Acknowledging the pain and suffering that he caused.
Absolutely. Before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to turn the conversation back to you, our listener.
Yeah.
What aspects of Pierce's story are resonating with you the most? Are you more interested in the legal battles, the psychological factors, or the broader societal implications of his crimes? Let us know, because we're going to get into all that and more in our final part. We've been going through this disturbing puzzle that is the life and crimes of William Pierce Jr.
Yeah, we have.
And as we're wrapping up this deep dive, I think it's important to shift our focus from the individual to the broader context.
Okay.
Pierce's crimes didn't happen, in a vacuum.
Right.
He was operating during a very specific time in American history, the early 1970s.
Yeah, a time of, great social and political upheaval.
Exactly, a time of Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, a struggling economy. There was a lot of unrest and disillusionment, maybe even like a collective anxiety that was, permeating society.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
So do you think that that atmosphere could have played a role in Pierce's actions? And I'm not trying to excuse his behavior in any way, but could those societal tensions have somehow, contributed to his descent into violence?
Well, it's a tough question, and we have to be careful not to draw, those direct lines of causality.
Right.
But it's worth thinking about how those societal factors can influence individual behavior.
Right.
When people feel insecure or when they feel like the world is, out of control,
Right.
it's possible that some individuals will lash out in extreme ways.
It's like that saying, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
Doesn't justify their actions, but it gives a little insight, I think, into that cyclical nature of violence and trauma.
It's a good point. It's a reminder that crime isn't always, a simple good versus evil story.
Right.
There are often, those deeper systemic issues at play: poverty, inequality, lack of access to mental health care.
Right.
And these factors, they can, create an environment where violence can take root.
And while we're talking about, these societal influences, we can't forget about the very real, very personal impact of Pierce's crime.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, for every life that he took, there was a family that was left shattered, a community grappling with this fear and grief.
That's why it's so important to engage with true crime in a responsible way.
Right.
It's easy to get caught up in the sensationalism,
Right.
the detective work, the psychological profiles.
Right.
But we have to remember these are real people, real lives that were tragically cut short.
Right.
And their stories deserve to be treated with respect and sensitivity.
You're absolutely right. It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
We're fascinated by these dark corners of human behavior.
Right.
But we can't let that fascination overshadow the human cost.
Exactly. And that kind of brings us back to, the big question.
Right.
What can we learn from this case?
Yeah, what can we learn from William Pierce Jr.? What insights can we take away from this dark chapter in history?
Yeah.
For me, it really highlights the importance of early intervention. If we can identify those who are struggling with mental health issues, maybe experiencing trauma, who are at risk of harming themselves or others,
Right.
perhaps we can intervene before it's too late.
That's a really powerful point. And it's not just about intervention, it's about prevention.
Right.
Creating a society that supports mental well-being, that addresses poverty and inequality, that provides opportunities for everybody to thrive.
Right.
That's how we can start to break these cycles of violence.
And I think it also shows how important it is to have a fair and just legal system,
Uh-huh.
one that protects the rights of the accused while also, making sure there is justice for the victims.
Right.
Those questions surrounding his confession and the potential coercion during the interrogation, those are issues that are still relevant today.
Absolutely. We need to constantly be, scrutinizing our systems,
Right.
making sure that they are operating with integrity and transparency.
Right.
That's how we prevent wrongful convictions and ensure that justice is served for everybody.
And I think ultimately Pierce's story is a stark reminder of how fragile life is.
Yeah,
That darkness can lurk within the human heart
it's true.
and the importance of compassion and empathy.
It's a difficult truth, but it's a necessary one.
Yeah, it is. And by, grappling with these uncomfortable realities,
Right.
striving to understand these complexities of human behavior, perhaps we can create a world where stories like William Pierce Jr.'s are less frequent, less tragic.
I hope so.
We hope this deep dive into the life and crimes of William Pierce Jr. has been both informative and thought-provoking for you.
Yeah, me too.
It's a complex case that raises so many questions about individual responsibility, societal influences, and the very nature of justice. We encourage you to continue exploring these questions, maybe delve a little deeper into the sources that we've talked about, and to keep seeking understanding.
Yeah, keep learning.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.